Learning to play Beethoven's Für Elise in private piano lessons this semester has been quite interesting, and the choice to research its history has been truly rewarding. Although Für Elise may perhaps be one of the most easily recognizable selections of all time, many people don't know much about the history of the song itself. However, there is much to be said about Beethoven's Für Elise. Für Elise was published in 1867. This simple detail becomes more interesting when taken into consideration that Beethoven died in 1827. This means that although Beethoven wrote the piece, for whatever reason he never had it published before he died. Ludwig Noll is actually the one accredited with publishing Für Elise. Ludwig is thought to have discovered Beethoven's manuscript of Für Elise sometime in 1867. He had it published shortly after finding it. This means that it was published almost 40 years after the death of Beethoven. Since Beethoven was long gone by this point, it's hard to know for sure when he actually wrote the piece. But when Noll found the manuscript, he found some clues along with it. He noticed that the date written on the manuscript was April 27, 1810, which implies that this is the day Beethoven finished composing Für Elise. Beethoven lived in Vienna, and thus the events that took place there must have affected Beethoven, at least to some extent. One major event that took place shortly before 1810 was Napoleon's invasion of Vienna. In May of 1809, Napoleon's forces bombarded Vienna. Although it's hard to say how this affected Beethoven, this event, paired with the fact that Beethoven was probably completely deaf at this point, deafness had set in around 1806, and almost utterly alone, 1810 was most likely a very stressful, depressing time in Beethoven's life. A few other interesting facts about Beethoven in regards to the year that he wrote Für Elise include the following. There was a review written in 1810 by E.T.A. Hoffmann that said that Beethoven was one of the three great Romantic composers. It is also believed that the work that Beethoven did in the middle period of his life is what has established him as a master composer. We know that Für Elise was written at some time during this middle period, which was the period in which Beethoven composed many of his most well-known works, so it's no wonder that this piece has become so highly regarded. Another interesting thing about Beethoven is the fact that he wrote a woman named Josephine 15 love letters between the years 1804 and 1810. It is apparent in the letters between these two that Josephine reciprocated Beethoven's love, but was unfortunately forced to withdraw from him in 1807. She ended up marrying Baron von Stackelberg in 1810. It is believed that this event caused Beethoven to unsuccessfully propose to Therese Malfatti, who just so happens to be one of the supposed dedicatees of Für Elise. There are many different ideas on who Elise actually is, and since no one ever had the opportunity to ask Beethoven himself, speculations are the only explanations out there. Some people believe that Beethoven wrote this song for an elderly poetess he knew, named Elise, but it's also believed that he didn't meet her until 1811, so this doesn't seem like the most logical explanation. Rather, the following seems like the most persuasive explanation. This quite charming little piano piece comes from the estate of Therese Malfatti. Noll explained further that it was not composed for Therese, but according to the inscription in Beethoven's hand, was written for Elise. He also added that Baroness von Glickjenstein, Therese's sister, couldn't recall who Elise was. As far as experts know, there wasn't anyone named Elise in Beethoven's circle of friends, so if this piece was indeed written for Elise and not Therese, no one really knows who she is. One other interesting thing about this piece is the fact that the first three notes of the song technically spell Elise. Kopitz presents the finding by the German organ scholar Johannes Quack that the letters that spell Elise can be decoded as the first three notes of the piece. Because an E-flat is called an S in German and is pronounced as S, that makes E-L-I-S-E, E-L-I-E, flat E, which by enharmonic equivalence sounds the same as the written notes E, L, I, D sharp, E, hence Elise. The basic structure of this piece is A-B-A-C-A, a rondo structure. It's possible that each of these three sections could be broken up into a few smaller sections as well, but for this analysis the focus is going to be on just those three main sections. The main key of this piece is A minor. The other key that this piece includes for a short time is F major. Of course, there are quite a few measures in this piece which deal with either key changes or section changes. Measure 1 starts out in A minor with a theme that continues in A minor for all of section A, but then changes keys to F major when we get into section B, which starts in the last half of measure 23. The key in section B then gradually modulates to C major. This modulation takes place at the end of measure 28. Once this piece is solidly in C major, the B section is finished just before switching keys back to A minor and returning to the original A section of the piece in measure 40. Once the A section has been repeated, the piece then moves on to a C section. This section begins in measure 60 in the key of A minor. It continues in A minor until about measure 72. At this point, the piece goes into a temporary B-flat major key for the next 4 measures. After the temporary detour, the piece returns to the key of A minor just in time to reach its climax. The climax of this piece takes place in measures 80 through 84, with the highest point of the piece taking place in measure 83. After the climax finishes, the piece returns to the original A section of the piece and repeats this section exactly to finish off the composition. This theme plays with lots of lower neighboring tones and half steps. It consists of mostly 16th notes and some 8th notes. It also has a lot of 1 and 5 separated or rolling chords in the left hand. It seems that the theme pretty much just sticks to the pattern 1-5-1, 1-5-1 in the left hand the entire time. The initial cadence in the first theme is slightly less conclusive than the last cadence of the main theme. Beethoven doesn't change this theme throughout the piece either. In other words, although the theme repeats itself a couple of different times, it is always repeated exactly. It is never changed. In order to better analyze this piece, the single climax of the piece, which takes place in measures 78 through 84, needs to be analyzed. There are a few different reasons that Beethoven could have chosen to use this type of climax at this particular point in the song. But Beethoven most likely used this type of climax as a segue back to the main theme, and as a transition from the C section back to the A section. It's interesting that there is a major tension and release at this point as well. The climax contains the highest note of the song and is preceded by a long run up to the highest note and succeeded by a long chromatic run down afterwards. This run ends by going back into the main theme, which happens to contain half steps and therefore goes along quite nicely after a long chromatic series of half steps. The climax is perhaps the most interesting and important portion of this piece. Of course, there are other important measures as well, though. Measures 14 through 16 are interesting because although they don't sound that different than any other measures, when played, different fingerings than one would expect are to be used, and that makes it take on a whole new level of interest. The best explanation for this is that the same few notes are played repeatedly, but with alternating hands. Beethoven's reasoning behind these fingerings are most likely purely artistic because during this era, composers often used unexpected fingerings to create a sense of excitement in those who were playing the piece. Measure 32 is also particularly interesting because there is a turn on the C in that measure. This means that immediately following the C, the note above that note is to be played, then the note itself, followed by the note below that note, and then finally the note itself one after another. This type of ornamentation was quite typical in the classical period, and Beethoven was no exception to using it in an attempt to be artistic and creative. Measure 36 through 38 are also interesting because at this point there's a cadence-like feel when the piece modulates from C to A in measure 36. There is also a ritardando in measure 37, which makes these few measures even more interesting. Measure 68 is also an interesting measure. This measure is interesting because it sounds quite intense. It's in the middle of the C section, which is overall more intense than the other two sections, but this particular measure seems to be the most intense measure of this section because there is a lot of dissonance here. This dissonance is achieved by playing an E flat, A, C, F sharp, and another A all at the same time. And although the dissonance is resolved soon thereafter, this particular measure really sticks out as something different and interesting because of it. Finally, the very last measure of this entire piece is another point of major interest. This measure, measure 104, is very important because it finishes the piece. This measure gives the listener a sense of conclusion by completing the theme with nothing more than a simple one chord in a perfect, authentic cadence. Although there is still plenty more to be said about this composition, this analysis has shed much light on the piece itself. Since Beethoven's Für Elise may indeed be one of the most easily recognizable tunes of all time, next time it's playing, hopefully this background information will help to bring to memory all of the interesting moments in this piece, as well as all of the effort that Beethoven must have put into composing it.